Spain is a country in southwestern Europe that has played a pivotal role in the formation of culture and history in both Europe and the Americas. The current Spanish identity is the result of centuries of conquest, trade, conversion and more, but actually you could even question the existence of one Spanish identity, as the country consists of many cultural groups like the Catalans, Galicians, Basques and Castilians, with the latter being the most dominant and influential. In this video I will try to focus on all linguistic and cultural groups that make up the modern country of Spain, which is definitely going to be a challenge but seems fair. Spanish history goes back too far to pinpoint one specific start, but I think the time that the Greeks, Phoenicians, Carthaginians and Romans got in contact with the Iberian Peninsula is a good starting point. At around this time, the Mediterranean coast of Iberia was inhabited by the Iberians, the southwest was inhabited by Tortesians, the modern Basque region was inhabited by Aquitanians, who were actually related to the modern day Basques, and the interior and Atlantic coast was inhabited mostly by Celts, although the related Lusitanians and Teutons also inhabited big parts of the interior. If you think this is complicated, brace yourselves, because there were also Phoenicians and Greeks who established several settlements all across the eastern and southern coast during the 6th century BC. Later, the Carthaginians would also arrive, conquering a big part of Iberia, but still struggling with the Greeks. Not long after that, the Romans also got in contact with the peninsula and thus also the Carthaginians. These two powers would end up fighting over control in the western Mediterranean. Rome won this war and a big part of the former Carthaginian lands in Iberia became part of the Roman Republic. The Romans then started a process of Romanization, while at the same time conquering the rest of Iberia, which they finished in 17 BC after the last bit of territory held by a mix of rebelling Celts and Iberians was annexed. The Roman province of Hispania became one of the most well-integrated parts of the Republic and later Empire. The Romans also improved the already existing cities and even founded some new ones, such as Zaragoza, Valencia and Leon. In the early 5th century though, the Romans started to lose their grip on Iberia to the Germanic Vandals and Suebi, and the Iranian Alans, and eventually in 476, when the Roman Empire had fallen, the peninsula had started to be controlled mostly by the Germanic Visigoths, but also by the Suebi and Basque in the northwest. The period of Gothic rule in Iberia fully started when the Visigoths had conquered all of the Suebi land in 585. The Visigoths would also control most of Iberia all the way up until the 8th century from the capital Toledo. One way the former province of Hispania differentiated itself from other former Roman territories is that it didn't destruct all Roman culture after the fall of the empire. Not only the language but also the religion and laws mostly remained. This could be explained because both the local population and the Visigothic elite had been Romanized. Besides this, the Visigoths also continued participating in the western Mediterranean trade. When in 578 the Visigoth king Recared I converted to Catholicism, the religious divide between the Arian higher class and the Catholic population also ceased to exist. But don't be mistaken, the rule of the Visigoths wasn't nearly as clear and strict as the one by the Romans. The Visigoths tended to rule as semi-barbarians, not caring about what happened in their kingdom. The Visigoth higher class didn't mix with the local vulgar Latin-speaking population either. This would only change after the Muslim conquest, which started in 711, when the Visigoths lost their power. Eventually the Muslims would have control of almost the entirety of Iberia by 718. The Muslims controlled most of Iberia for some centuries, and I won't be going into detail as the Muslim rulers obviously weren't really Spanish, but I still think I have to talk about them for at least a little while, because they did have a pretty significant influence on Spain. So, first you had the Umayyad Caliphate, with the deal with the resistance of the Christian Asturias kingdom. Then you had the Emirate of Cordoba, with the deal with Viking attacks. Then you had the Caliphate of Cordoba, that eventually splintered into many different taifas, who all fought both each other and the recently formed Christian kingdoms in the north. Then in 1085, the unified kingdoms of Castile and Leon took Toledo, which made the Muslim taifas invite the North African Almoravides to invade Iberia and establish a Muslim empire. Then in 1147 the Almoravides fell, resulting in many taifas for the second time. And then lastly, the Almohad Caliphate from northern Africa invaded Iberia to unify the taifas again, while this moment was also used by the Christian kingdoms of Portugal, Leon, Castile, Navarre and Aragon, who jointly attacked the Almohad Caliphate and pushed them back all the way to Granada, where they would remain up until as late as 1492, when the Reconquista was finally finished. Now modern Catholic Spanish history could finally start, but let's first have a look at these kingdoms that would later make up Spain before I talk about Columbus, the Inquisition and the Unification. And let's leave Portugal out of this, since that's a whole different story for another video. In all of these kingdoms, languages based on Vulgar Latin were spoken by the population that was a result of mixing between the former Visigoth upper class and the Roman Iberian population. In Castile, Castilian was most widely spoken. This language would later become what is now known as Spanish. In Leon, Leonese, Galician and Asturian were most widely spoken, although all of this would gradually be replaced by Castilian after Leon became part of Castile in 1230. In Aragon, the languages Aragonese and Catalan were most widely spoken, and in Navarre the language isolated of Basque was most widely spoken, although Aragonese was also used in more formal situations. In the same year that Granada was finally conquered by Castile and Aragon, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, who had also established the Spanish Inquisition 14 years earlier, gave permission to the Genoese sailor Christopher Columbus to find a way to East Asia by sailing westwards. This was to rival the Portuguese, who had established a trade monopoly by being the only country capable of making the voyage to the Indies around Africa at the time. This resulted in Christopher Columbus becoming the first European to reach the New World since Viking Leif Erikson. But let's digress a little bit about the Inquisition, because I think it's a very important part of Spanish history. Like I just said, the so-called Catholic monarchs had established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. This Inquisition was originally primarily focused on checking up on the recently to Catholicism converted Muslims and Jews, after most of the former Muslim lands had been retaken. It later got much worse after Muslims and Jews were also forced to convert to Catholicism or leave Spain. This resulted in the prosecution of an estimated 150,000 people over the entire period of the Inquisition, all the way up until 1834 when it was officially disbanded, although the Inquisition had been very active in the 18th and 19th century compared to the centuries before that. Back to Isabella and Ferdinand, whose grandson Charles I inherited the title of both King of Castile and King of Aragon in 1516, which meant that Spain was finally united as the Kingdom of Spain. Because his father wasn't only King of Castile, but also Lord of the Netherlands and Duke of Burgundy, and the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and because Aragon had many overseas possessions in Sardinia and southern Italy, he inherited all of these lands too, and also became the head of the Habsburg monarchy, and thus was the natural candidate to be the elected Holy Roman Emperor, which happened. Spain was now controlled by a man whose full title was
Charles, by the grace of God, Holy Roman Emperor, forever August, King of Germany, King of Italy, King of all Spain, of Castile, Aragon, Leon, of Hungary, of Dalmatia, of Croatia, Navarre, Granada, Toledo, Valencia, Galicia, Mallorca, Sevilla, Cordoba, Murcia, Jaén, Algeciras, Gibraltar, the Canary Islands, King of two Sicilies, Sardinia, Corsica, King of Jerusalem, King of the Western and Eastern Indies, of the islands and mainland of the Ocean Sea, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Brabant, Lorraine, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, Limburg, Luxembourg, Gelderland, Neopatria, Württemberg, Landgrave of Alsace, Prince of Swabia, Asturia, and Catalonia, Count of Flanders, Habsburg, Tyrol, Gorizia, Barcelona, Artois, Burgundy, Palatine, Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland, Ferret, Kieber, Namur, Roussillon, Cerdan, Drenthe, Zutphen, Margraf, the Holy Roman Empire, Burgos, Oristano, and Goitiano, Lord of Frisia, the West March, Pordenone, Biscay, Moulins, Salins, Tripoli, and Mechelen.
Yep, that's for real. At the end of his life, Charles ended up splitting the Habsburg inheritance into two parts. On one hand was the Spanish part, which included Spain, its possessions in Sardinia, southern Italy, Burgundy, the Netherlands, and all of its colonies. On the other hand was the title of Holy Roman Emperor. After his abdication in 1556, Spain and its possessions in Europe and the Americas went to his son Philip II, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor went to his brother Ferdinand I. Now let's have a look at these colonies I just mentioned, because in 1556, when Philip II inherited them, there were already a lot, and I didn't even talk about them yet. After Columbus had rediscovered the Americas for Europe, Spain quickly started opening up regular trade across both the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the 1520s, they began large-scale extraction of silver in Mexico, and later also in other parts of Latin America. The resources they acquired through their colonies became of the uttermost importance in the financing of their military back in Europe. The Spanish Golden Age had begun. Throughout most of the 16th and 17th century, Spain dominated the oceans with its great navy and its treasure from the Americas. Spain had become filthy rich by exploiting the Americas and African slaves to the fullest extent, and had the biggest empire at the time, which would stay that way until the 19th century. But let's get back to Europe, where since 1556, the Spanish King Philip II ruled lands all over the continent. In 1568 though, the Protestant northern Netherlands started their revolt and eventually broke away. Despite this, Philip still managed to end up becoming King of Portugal in 1580, and Spain and Portugal, although still independent, would remain in a personal union all the way up until 1640 under King Philip II, the Third and the Fourth. Although the wars with the Dutch and English damaged Spain's reputation, they managed to recover and remain the leading power of Europe. Only later, after the Spanish king lost its title as King of Portugal to the House of Braganza in 1640, Spain started to slowly shrink in importance. Administrative and economic problems kept growing bigger, and the fact that many important Jews and Muslims had been leaving the country as ordered didn't help either. Eventually, Spain also started to rely on their silver imports too much, and all this together resulted in several bankruptcies and an economic crisis in the country. Around the same time, Spain was also plagued with attacks from pirates from northern Africa and the Ottoman Empire, who had attacked coastal cities in Spain, raiding cities and capturing the local population to sell them as slaves on the Ottoman and Arab slave market. In total, over 1 million Europeans were sold in these markets, of which a lot were Spanish. Besides this, the Great Plague of Seville also killed between 600,000 and 700,000 people nationwide, or about 10% of the total Spanish population. The mentally and physically disabled Charles II ended up being the last Habsburg king of Spain, and after he died in 1700, the War of Spanish Succession, where European powers fought for power in Spain, ended in a victory for the British, Dutch and Austrians. But because the candidate for the throne became Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, the French Bourbons, who initially lost, still got the Spanish throne. However, the deal did prohibit France and Spain to unify, and Austria also took most Spanish lands in Italy. In 1713, Philip V was recognized as the first Bourbon king of Spain, who now ruled a country that had been in great decline since the second half of the 17th century. Spain gradually recovered from this crisis, and prosperity increased all across the empire, both in Europe and the colonies. This is mostly due to the French ideas of enlightenment, brought through this brand new French king, and eventually Spain would even support the United States in their War of Independence. Then the Napoleonic Wars happened, where Spain let French troops cross the territory to attack Portugal, but was instead occupied itself. The king was forced to abdicate, and Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, was installed as a puppet monarch, and was generally speaking very disliked by the Spanish population. This led to many nationalist uprisings, and eventually a devastating war of independence known as the Peninsular War, leading to over 1 million deaths and a victory for Spain. But unfortunately for Spain it was too late, and the Napoleonic Wars had helped the already long and happy American colonies of Spain, who fought several wars of independence from 1809 to 1833. By the end of these wars, only Puerto Rico and Cuba remained. All this turmoil in the early 19th century led Spain in economic and political chaos. A civil war and conflicts between liberals and anti-liberals and conservatives and progressives eventually result in a more stable Kingdom of Spain, with a rotation of government control between progressive and conservative liberals, known as Turnismo. Besides the Spanish-American War, where Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam and the Philippines, the period up until the Civil War was quite stable and prosperity increased. Autonomy was given to the Basque Country, Catalonia and Galicia, and women were given the right to vote. Spain also colonized Western Sahara, Spanish Morocco and Equatorial Guinea during the scramble for Africa, and remained neutral during World War I. But then, because of rising tensions between left and right, nationalist and anarchist, conservative and progressive, and aristocrat and republican, Spain fell into a civil war in 1936. On one hand were the mostly communist republicans, and on the other side were the nationalists, led by Francisco Franco. Over 2.5 years of fighting resulted in over 500,000 deaths, and a victory for the nationalists, made possible by Nazi German and Italian support. But don't be mistaken, Spain did not participate in World War II, but only loosely collaborated with the Axis. This is why it managed to remain a semi-fascist dictatorship until much after the war had ended. This didn't mean Spain was liked by the West though. It was initially left out of the United Nations and remained economically isolated. Only after 1955, when the Cold War was intensifying and America needed an ally on the Iberian Peninsula, did Spain start to cooperate with the West. Shortly after, Spain started industrializing at a much larger rate and opened its borders for mass tourism. It would still take until 1975 though, for Franco to die and for Juan Carlos I to become king. In 1978 the constitution was approved and the restoration of democracy started. And all the way up until today, Spain has slowly been getting more Western. In 1982 they joined NATO, and in 1986 they joined the EEC, the predecessor of the EU, which, like I said in the Bulgaria video, despite your opinions on the structure and intention of the organization, is still a good measure of how well a country is doing, considering the EU's strict membership requirements. Although discrimination of linguistic minorities has stopped on a governmental level since Franco's death, the country still struggles to hold on to regions with their own strong identities. The biggest example of this is probably ETA, a radical Basque nationalist terrorist organization, and more recently the Declaration of Independence of Catalonia. Holding on to these different ethno-linguistic groups, plus the stagnating economy, are probably Spain's biggest challenges for the future. And I am interested to seeing what the future brings for this country. In the end, this all doesn't take away the fact that Spain is a beautiful country with a very interesting language and culture that has definitely left its mark on world history.